Inflation. Over the last 2 decades here in the UK, it has not been too problematic overall to you or your business. However, what are the effects of higher than normal inflation on your business? And most importantly, what can you do to protect your business from it? In part 1 of this series, we will cover what exactly is inflation and its causes, what is purchasing power and how inflation erodes this, how is inflation measured here in the UK at least, historical inflationary trends and future forecasts and why they matter. And in part 2, we will cover the relationship between your business and inflation, the relationship between taxation and inflation, and finally, 4 ways you can protect your business against inflation. Before I get into today's video, be sure to visit our Accounting and Tax Academy membership area, where you can get access to exclusive in-depth courses, templates, calculators, and a members-only Q&A section where you can get your specific accounting and tax questions answered by a qualified accountant or chartered tax advisor. Inflation can be simply described as a general and sustained rise in prices of goods and services in an economy. But what type of prices, you may be asking? Well, for example, common household expenses such as your utility bills, that is gas, electric and water, food and drink shopping, the cost of fuel like petrol or diesel to run your motor vehicle, to name but a few. The causes of inflation can be explained simply by basic economics, and that is demand and supply. So imagine your favourite trainers, and in a normal economy only 1,000 pairs are bought or demanded every year. So therefore only 1,000 pairs are produced to meet this demand. As a result, the price is set at £50. All of a sudden, the demand for these trainers increases to 1,500 per year, but the production remains at 1,000 per year as the factory does not have enough resources to increase the number of trainers made. So what happens next? Quite simple, because more people are chasing fewer trainers, the trainers end up being sold to the higher bidders. In other words, the price starts to rise, let's say to £60. At this price point, the demand will fall, let's say to £1,300, as 200 people cannot afford or not willing to meet the new price point of £60. And so on. The price will continue to increase until it reaches a sort of equilibrium. So let's assume £70 is where the demand meets the supply of 1,000 trainers. And this is what is known as demand pull inflation. The reverse is also inflationary. That is when supply of trainers is decreased, let's say from 1,000 to 800, and the demand remains at 1,000. An increase in the money supply, such as quantitative easing here in the UK and across the world. If governments decide to effectively print more money, they are increasing the money supply, and therefore more money is chasing fewer goods and services in the economy. But this is all a very simplified view of inflation, as there are other factors that are going into the mix that trigger and cause sustained inflation. What exactly is purchasing power? Well, let me explain this concept with an example. Suppose your business sold candles online and earned £10,000 in January, and you banked it after paying all business taxes. In January 20x1, this £10,000 could buy your business 1,000 new candles from your supplier, that is at £10 each. But you sit on the money and do nothing with it for a year. During the year, the official rate of inflation tracked at 15%. So in January 20x2, you decide to use this £10,000 and buy some candles to mark up and sell. However, your suppliers raise prices by 15% in line with inflation, and now your £10,000 can only buy 870 candles. That's 130 candles less than this time last year. And this is what effectively inflation does. It erodes the purchasing power of your money over time. So if you are a saver of money, then higher than normal rates of inflation can harm your overall financial wealth over time. In simple terms, inflation is measured by the basket of goods principle. In formal terms, the basket of goods are referred to as representative items. So the UK government takes a basket of common goods and services that the likes of you and me purchase and consume, measures the prices over a period of time, and as a result works out the rate of inflation at a point and period of time. That is as simple as I can make it. In the UK, the 2 main rates of inflation are the CPI. This is a measure produced to international standards and in line with European regulations. First published in 1997, CPI is the inflation measure used for the Bank of England's inflation target, which I'll discuss in the next section. Next is the CPIH. This is the most comprehensive measure of consumer price inflation, which extends the CPI to include owner-occupiers, housing costs and council tax. This is probably a more accurate reflection of inflation for you and I, as how can you simply ignore your gas and electric costs and your council tax? But That's what the UK government does with CPI, and I'll tell you why later on. And unsurprisingly, the CPIH rate of inflation is normally higher than the CPI rate. There is also the RPI measurement, and for those of you who are perhaps in their 30s and above, you'll remember this was the main measurement back in the day. It's a legacy measure that is continually published in accordance with the Statistics and Registration Services Act of 2007, and because of its use in long-term contracts and index-linked gilts, these are government bonds, is still being measured today. It includes property expenses such as mortgage interest costs. The table on screen shows how the CPIH is collated through what is known as representative items in categories with a particular weighting. So for example, household and household services has an overall weighting of 29.8% towards the CPIH index, as it is deemed that this on average represents a proportion of income that is spent on this category. It'll include items like your council tax, for example. Finally, the CPI is used by the government to determine government-provided things, such as your state pension, income support benefits, housing benefits, universal credit, SSP, that is statutory sick pay, statutory maternity pay, and paternity pay. Now, can you see the dichotomy of this? The government uses the lower CPI rate to raise government-provided money, but in reality, you and your business are more likely to be impacted by inflation at the CPIH or even the RPI rate, which are invariably higher. Now, to make sure you get things into context, inflation in itself is not a major problem for you or your business. That is low or soft levels of inflation, which here in the UK is deemed at around 2%. You see, the Bank of England, that is the central bank here in the UK, is mandated to control inflation. That is the CPI rate to this level. But why? The Bank of England ultimately controls monetary policy. This is essentially the money supply of Great British pounds. And like all central banks in the world, the Bank of England are acutely aware that excessively high rates of inflation can lead to catastrophic economic effects. And in the worst case scenario, the collapse of the currency, that is GBP pounds itself. Now, this may seem far-fetched, but history is witness to many empires and countries that have collapsed as a result of runaway hyperinflation. Examples include the Roman Empire, the Weimar Republic, that is pre-World War II Germany, and more recently, Zimbabwe. You see, once you and the general population loses confidence in the currency you hold, in this case, Great British pound sterling, then you will seek an alternative medium of exchange, perhaps the US dollar or gold, or more recently, cryptocurrencies. And once enough of the population does this, it normally spells the end of the government in power or even the monetary system itself. Now, there's an excellent video on this by Mike Maloney that is worth watching, which you can access by clicking in the link on the description box below. So when should you be concerned about inflation, and how much thought and energy should you give it with regards to your business? Historically, you see, inflation has not been a major problem at all here in the UK. The graph shows that the inflation trend since 1989, and in 1990 it peaked at 9.2%. Aside from a couple of further peaks, inflation has been kept under tight control and really has popped up above 2.5%, with recent history showing rates of 1% and below. However, in recent months, due to the copious amounts of money printed by the UK government and perhaps many governments across the world to combat the coronavirus crisis, now the money supply has likely increased, and there is always a time lag between turning on the money printing taps and inflation. Throw in increasing energy prices, and the predictions for inflation in the near term are pointing towards 4%, and some commentators and analysts are predicting well upwards of this. You can access the Bank of England's monetary policy report by clicking on the link in the description box below. Inflation is often controlled by a monetary tool known in simple language as interest rates. This is the first thing the Bank of England will consider should inflation start to rise above their mandated target level of 2%. A rise in interest rates has the effect of reducing your disposable income. Therefore, in theory at least, slow down the rate of your spending and thus inflation. In part 2, I go into the relationship between your business and inflation, between taxation and inflation, and provide you with 4 actionable ways you can protect your business against increasing inflation.